All right, so we're going to take this last section in logical argument to talk about some basic logical fallacies. And but by this I mean they're not exact mathematical fallacies. They're just logical fallacies that some people will argue, which does not actually, how do I say, better their case or worsen their opponent's case. But a lot of these things actually happen in day-to-day arguments. So my point of doing this is that oftentimes people will say if P then Q, but their arguments will have the wrong reasoning, right? Maybe Q doesn't actually follow from P. In other words, some people will say, well, P therefore P implies Q. Okay, if P then Q. But is there really a connection between P and Q? Okay, how can we argue that there's a connection? All right, and I'm trying to get some of the very very common logical argumentative fallacies that people do. And by the way, it's not a new thing. It's a very old type of thing. People have all kinds of wrong reasoning, and probably each one of us does it on some occasion. Okay? Now, one thing I want to be very clear of is that this is not a complete list. There are many, many different types of logical fallacies out there. And I hope this is more of a springboard into that kind of stuff. If you're interested in watching political debates and those kinds of things, that you have a sort of springboard into those things rather than a complete view. So the first type of fallacy is something that's called a straw man. And sometimes it's called a straw man argument. But it's distorting somebody else's argument to make it easier to refute. Okay? So for instance, let's assume that there's a politician out there who wants to reform some healthcare law. All right? Now, instead of actually arguing the reforms, what a different politician may say is a different politician may say something like, my opponent wants to make sure the elderly cannot see doctors. Well, that may be an outright lie. Maybe there was something about politician's A argument that had to do with elderly and the doctors. Maybe it's an outright lie. But politician B is undoubtedly distorting politician A's argument. And he's distorting it so that it's easier to refute. Okay? This happens a lot of times. You'd be amazed at when people argue. All of the time, we tend to oversimplify our opponent's arguments. And that leads to bad results. Okay? So when we oversimplify each other's arguments, then it becomes harder to talk and harder to understand other people who have maybe different views from yourselves. Now, the second type of argument that you may hear that's a logical fallacy is called an ad hominem. Now, this isn't where you attack the person's argument. This is where you attack the person's character. Okay? So maybe a person says that they think it's a good thing to reform the tax code. And another person, rather than actually arguing about the tax code, says, well, how can we trust them when they cheated on their spouse? Now, obviously, cheating on your spouse really doesn't have anything to do with the tax code. And anytime that there's an attack on somebody's character, that's an ad hominem attack. Okay? Now, by the way, some people don't understand the difference between ad hominem attacks and just restating something. Just because you restate an argument it's not, doesn't necessarily mean that it's ad hominem. Just because you point out that, that a person has said X, Y, and Z, doesn't mean it's ad hominem, right? Ad hominem is something where you're attacking their character, not their argument. Now, another very commonplace logical fallacy is what's known as the false dilemma. Okay? And this is, again, a very common thing to use. So, you give a question that only has two options. And in reality, there could be a lot more. Okay? There's a lot of late night news people who try to use this strategy. Okay? And they'll say things like, do you like policy A or are you a Nazi? Right? Or they'll ask a question like, yes or no, do you believe in this? Well, when the answer is not exactly a yes or no question. Okay? An example would be, do you support tax reductions or are you communist? Well, there's probably middle ground, right? You can not support tax reductions and not be a communist. You can support tax reductions and be a communist, right? So the point is, here we have two options in a sea of a lot of options, okay? One false dilemma that I've heard recently is has to do with gay marriage. They'll say, do you support gay marriage or do you oppose gay marriage? Well, there's actually middle ground there, right? You may not support or oppose gay marriage, okay? You may be somewhere in the middle where you don't care. It may be the fact that, there may be a third option, like, for instance, you may not think the government shouldn't have anything to do with marriage, right? So typically when people say, do you support or oppose, they're saying, do you support the government outlawing it or the government supporting it? Well, you may think, well, the government should have no business in marriage whatsoever, right? So there's other options there. Again, I'm not telling you which arguments to like and which arguments not to like, but I'm saying oftentimes we get these situations where we have false dilemmas. Now, again, another very common logical fallacy is appealing to the popular. So you say, well, it has to be true because lots of people believe it. Okay? So, for instance, taxing the rich must be good for the country because 60 people, want to tax the rich. Say it's a good idea. Or, raising the minimum wage is a good idea because 70% of people believe it. Or, I'm not saying that those things are definitely false. I'm just saying that just because you appeal to the popular, just because you say most people want it or most people think that way, doesn't make it a true statement. If most people thought 2 plus 3 was 6, right? That doesn't make 2 plus 3 6. Okay? 2 times 3 is 6. But just because people think 2 plus 3 is 6 doesn't mean it's true. Okay? Now, a lot of people may think 2 plus 3 is 5. Now, 2 plus 3 is 5, but not because a lot of people think that. It's 5 because that's what it is, right? So, my point is to say the reasoning that a lot of people think it, so it must be true, is incorrect. Now, this brings me to the idea of fallacy of fallacies, because, right, maybe 80% of people think, or 90% of people believe 2 plus 3 is 5. Right? So the reasoning behind stating 2 plus 3 is 5 because a lot of people think it is wrong. But that doesn't mean 2 plus 3 is not 5. Okay? So a fallacy of fallacy is when you conclude a statement is wrong because it came from a logical fallacy. All right? So for instance, if I said 90% of people think 2 plus 3 is 5, and an opponent said, well, you used appeal to the popular. That's still, again, the conclusion may still be right. Just the argument is wrong. Right? Because, again, 90% of people could think 2 plus 3 is 5. 90% of people could think 2 plus 3 is 6. Okay? The appeal to the popular, the reasoning, is wrong in both cases. However, the conclusion is right in one of them. All right? So, just because the argument is bad doesn't mean that the conclusion is. Okay? So, here's another example. He said 90% of people think climate change is real. That's an argument which is appeal to the popular. Therefore, climate change is not real. So again, I'm not saying that is a fallacy of fallacies, concluding something is wrong because it came from an illogical argument or a logical fallacy. Okay? So, like I said, some logical fallacies give you the right conclusion. Other logical fallacies give you the wrong conclusion. All right? So it's not always wrong because it came from bad reasoning. It's not always right because it came from bad reasoning either. All right? And there's lots and lots of examples of these. I have included 2 links. Now, I'm not advocating for these 2 websites or anything like that. I used those because those were the first 2 that came up in the Google search that I did. There's lots and lots of other logical fallacies. And by the way, a lot of them are the same logical fallacy but different names. So appeal to the popular might be called, bandwagon, or it might be called something else rather than appeal to the popular, but it's the same idea. Okay? A fallacy of fallacies might be, it's phrased differently in some cases. So there's a lot of other examples of these. We will actually look at a couple of logical fallacies that are specific to some statistics later on in the course. But again, you can click on these 2 websites and see some others. And again, it's not a support of everything that the websites are or they stand for. I really don't know what these are, but they are the first couple that come up in the Google search. All right? So hopefully you got a good idea. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do on a quiz, on exercises, on a test, is give me what type of logical fallacies are being used. Okay? Whether it's an ad hominem or an appeal to a popular, or whether it's, those kinds of things. All right? Hopefully you've got that and are ready to go.